Should we start with some myths about watches themselves? What do you think?
Tell me why I'm wrong.
This is Openwork, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California, and we carry a wide range of independent brands, including Ming, Sartori Biard, Singer Reimagined, and more. To learn more about us and check our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Well, speaking of Ming, Sartori Biard, Singer Reimagined, and 8 brands total, we just wrapped our annual, what's become our annual open house event in LA. It's LA's first and only event dedicated to independent watchmaking. And yeah, it was our second year doing it. It was amazing. The turnout was wild. We sold out. I mean, before we even opened the doors of the event, we were fully booked, oversubscribed. The turnout was amazing. And first of all, it's so cool that so many people, not only across Southern California, came for this, but we had people come down from the Bay Area. We had a client who came from Hawaii. We had a client who came from New York City. I met some folks for the first time. One gentleman we had met at a windup actually came all the way from Philadelphia to LA
that's awesome.
for the event, which was really cool. So suffice it to say, we're going to keep doing it. This was not only the second, it will not be the last. There will be more open house events. So thank you to everyone who came. And in particular, thank you to the brands who came. Like I said, we had 8 brands total. And we had people who came all the way to the United States just for the event, which was really cool. So we had folks coming from Switzerland, from France, from Vienna.
Yep.
From Austria. So that was just amazing. Thank you so much to everyone who made it out. We appreciate it.
I got nothing to add except thank you.
Nothing but gratitude. All right. And I guess the only thing to add is if you want to attend an event like Open House in the future, the best way to find out about where we're going to be next and what we're doing in the future is to join our list. So just go to collectivehorology.com, click join our list. We will not spam you. We will not flood your inbox with emails, but we will let you know when things are happening like Open House and other events around the country.
Hey, Gabe, are we going to do Open House again?
I have no idea. Hard to say. Let's talk about today's show topic, myths. These are sort of the things that collectors have wrong about the watch industry. And that's not meant to be figure wagging or saying, you have it all wrong and anything like that. You must be corrected. It's more kind of like...
What are you talking about? Everybody loves when their AD tells them they're wrong.
Yeah, right. I think it's more of like, there are a number of these sort of widely held beliefs, memes or truths out there about watches and the watch industry that I think now from our unique perch in the industry, we've come to learn aren't necessarily true or are contradictions. This actually first came up back in our episode where we recapped our survey results from a couple months ago. And we saw you actually pulled this up that there were a number of contradictions in that data where people would sort of say one thing about watches and then behave in another way. And we're not going to recover those, but it brought to mind oh my gosh, beyond the survey data, we're aware of a number of these widely held beliefs that just kind of aren't true. And it might be interesting to sort of discuss them and discuss what the reality is. So as far as how we did this, we looked at a couple of sources. We did get a couple of these myths from results and feedback that came up in our survey data. We also just kind of looked at the watch world and the watch universe more broadly. We can easily, I think all of us can come up with these things that are these widely held beliefs among watch collectors. And then what we did was we took those and we looked at them against data. So we looked at them not only against our personal experience in the watch industry and what we see on a daily basis, selling watches every day, talking to collectors every day, working with brands every day, but what data actually tells us. So we're going to share these myths, and we're also going to share the data that sort of points out why and exactly how they're myths. We're going to break them into 2 pieces. So we've got myths about watches themselves, and then we have got myths about sort of the watch industry or general beliefs about the watch industry. And of course, we'll highlight along the way, and it will be available in the show notes at collectivehorology.com/blog, what all those data sources are. So if you're curious to learn more and curious to see what exactly the data says, you know where to find that information. So should we start with some myths about watches themselves? What do you think?
Tell me why I'm wrong.
And again, this is not why people are wrong. Some of these things, like, we wish were true, and we can point those out. It's just sort of like, oh, interesting. All these beliefs we've either held for years or out there in the zeitgeist. There's more than meets the eye.
Yeah, look, we a little bit inside baseball. We're re-recording this episode because there was an audio glitch, so a little bit of a repeat here for us. But one thing that kind of stuck with me as we were doing this is I felt a little bit like in our first recording, like we might have been wagging our fingers at folks about things. And I don't want to do that. But what I do want to do as we go through this, and we'll start with this first one here, is just from a purely objective standpoint, say, look, this is something that, like, we see people saying regularly, but then when we look at, for example, our own sales data, it just doesn't add up. And I think it's important to see that, like, where those misalignments are, not to demonstrate that anybody's right or wrong per se, but actually quite the opposite, to give people a little bit more permission to do ultimately what I think is the point here, which is to not let groupthink define what is a good thing or a bad thing. So to that point, one thing that we see regularly, that, you know, it's in the press, we see it in groups, you know, sometimes clients say it to us too, is that everybody wants smaller watches, so watches under 38 millimeters in diameter. Now, the reality there is a little bit less clear. When we look at the data, sub 38 millimeter watches are definitely doing better than they used to. So there's more people that are interested in them. But core demand really sits in that bullseye, that sort of Goldilocks zone of 38 to 41 millimeters. And the truth is, as somebody who sells watches that are sub 38 millimeters, it can be a little bit of a tough sell, even for a client that says, I'm looking for a smaller watch. And I think there's a couple of reasons behind that. And I'll give the subjective opinion. Then Gabe, if you want to fill in with some actual data. Sometimes when a client hears a number like 35 millimeters, they can't get past that, even though I think Zach Kazan did a reporting on this a couple months ago from Worn and Wound too. Even those numbers don't really tell the truth about how a watch wears, because as we all know, lug to lug is really a far better measurement of how something sits on your wrist than the diameter of the dial. There are some watches like the Blancpain 50 fathoms and 45 millimeters that, you know, you would think might be really big for a smaller wristed person, but it isn't, because of the way the lug to lug is structured. It's actually a very wearable watch. It's an awesome watch. And then there's some smaller watches that people put on their wrist and are like, man, that feels a lot bigger because of, say, I don't know, negative space on a dial, for example, which can really affect the way somebody sees wearability. So my point here is, when we make these, or see grand sweeping statements like, that's too big, or this is too small, or like the community feels this or that, the data doesn't really prove that out. And in fact, may actually deter somebody from checking out an incredible watch. Perfect example of this is the most recent Ming Project 21. Some of the buyers who saw that it was 35 millimeters were a little reticent initially. And then when they actually looked at the measurements, they put it on their wrist, they saw the watch wore really, really proportionally well.
The fact that it's tantalum also helps, because it gives what appears like a small watch some heft or the feel of presence on your wrist.
Gravitas.
It's like this optical illusion where it's like, whoa, like there is a satisfaction of like putting on like a heavy watch to some extent, because it feels like it's well made. And sometimes, at least for me, those smaller watches, it's not the gravitas, but they don't necessarily feel like, you know, they can take a beating.
Hey, side note, when someone says gravitas to you, do you think about Gravlocks?
Not at all.
Really?
No. Now I will. Thanks.
Yeah, I just think of fish. Okay, cool. So is there any actual quantitative data that proves this?
Yeah. So two things here. Let's talk about the quantitative data. Look, you're right. Smaller watches have grown in popularity, but all things are relative. The core of the market is really in 38 to 41 millimeter watches. And so when you look at selling data as far as what's transacting, say on watch charts and Chrono 24, the vast majority of watches that are transacting and that are selling and that are moving, and it's not just about what's trading, those are the things that people are buying.
Well, that's what we mean. Like,
that's in that size range. And then I think this is also demonstrated by the brands themselves. So if we look, say, at what Richemont and LVMH are doing with platforms like the Tank Watch or the Zenith Defy is another great example. These are watches that are being offered in more case sizes. So there are smaller case sizes and there are larger case sizes. And sometimes that means a bigger watch going down in size, like in the case of Zenith. And in the case of Cartier, which is kind of a brand that everyone talks about and thinks about as synonymous with smaller watches, they're actually sizing up. So you can get, for instance, a Cartier Santos tank watch, not only in its original size, but in a medium size or a large size. I don't know exactly what the diameters are. So it's a good way of demonstrating, like, yes, small watches are out there. They have a lot of mind share, but even among those, quote, small watches, some of those small watches are actually getting bigger, because that's where the core of taste lies. And that brings me to sort of my final qualitative point about all of this. A lot of times, I think people would imagine we might hear objections about watches being too large. Oh, that watch that you're selling that's 42 or 43 millimeters, I think it's too large for me. Ironically, as smaller watches have become more and more of the conversation, and brands are offering them and they sell, we actually have more objections to sale when it comes to size. The Ming Project 21 is a good example. We get more questions and objections about size with smaller watches now. I mean, people are kind of curious to try a smaller watch. They're out there in the popular imagination, but they're not so sure. And I see more kind of skepticism or reticence about size actually when it comes to smaller watches than larger ones, which I think is interesting and not what I would have expected at all. And that kind of leads to the next one. These are closely related. These two things go hand in hand. But another meme out there is, right now we're seeing a meteoric rise in popularity of dress watches and shaped watches. I'm putting these two things together and going hand in hand with that, this notion that, sports watches, no one really wants them anymore. They're just not as popular as they once were. It's really all about these sort of dress watches and shaped watches. And I think the story here is quite similar. We're seeing more and more of shaped watches and dress watches in the media. We're seeing more and more discussion of them. We're seeing more novelties from brands. But again, I think this is an example of the market diversifying, not switching. And sports watches, by far and away, and this is similar to the notion of size, but by far and away, sports watches not only represent the vast majority of demand, which is interesting. So if you look at export data from Switzerland, so the FHS export data, the number one category far and away, sort of has been for quite a long time and continues to be sports watches. They lead both in volume and in total value as a segment. The other thing that I think is interesting is when customers are surveyed. So when people are asked, and Deloitte did a Swiss watch industry study a couple of years ago where they asked consumers these questions. They asked them, what's the next watch you're considering? What do you aspire to own next? And so you'd think, okay, if tastes are shifting and the zeitgeist is shifting, maybe the thing I'd want to own next is changing as well. It remains sport watches. So I think the story here is really similar to these smaller watches, the dress watches, the shaped watches, the smaller watches. They are certainly gaining mind share. People are considering them more, but they really don't represent the heart of the market, and they really are sort of what we might call a vocal minority. But let's talk about integrated bracelet sports watches.
Mm-hmm. So there's this thought out there that they're just a fad. They're no longer popular. And I think when we look at industry data, so this is specifically pulled from, say, the Morgan Stanley reports, as well as just our own data looking at brands like Chapek, Chopard, Moser, Bell & Ross, etc. Demand not only is still strong for integrated steel sports watch, but production is increasing across the industry, not pulling back. What I think maybe gives a little bit of oxygen to this challenge or to this belief is that the segment is really crowded. And when it's like, think of dive watches, for example. How many brands can you think of that make a dive watch that is that fits really perfectly, say, within the trope of what a quote unquote dive watch looks like, right? So if we define like the traditional sort of idealistic design of a dive watch being, say, the Rolex Submariner, I'm sure everyone listening to this can imagine 15, 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 different watches that essentially look similar to that. So it's a crowded category. And I recognize, by the way, that's not technically an integrated stainless steel sports watch, but we can make that argument, say, for
no, but I think the analogy holds water.
Yeah, we can make that argument for a Royal Oak or for a Nautilus or what have you. The thing is, though, the reason that there's so much crowded space there is because the demand is so high. And really, I think what a lot of people are saying when they say that is they're looking for something to break out and to be really different. and to sit as something unique in that category. So like, for example, for me, I look at something and it's a brand we don't carry, but like the Laurent Ferrier Galet Sport.
You mean the Auto Sport?
Is that the model name? The
Yeah.
Auto Sport?
Yeah, the Auto Sport.
Pardon me. The Auto, I don't carry them, so there you go. But the Auto Sport, which is a watch that I find feels wholly original, but absolutely well anchored in the tradition of integrated sports watches, even though it's titanium, not steel. And that really stands apart. And it feels different. The Chapek Antarctique is a watch that we carry, which I also feel like stands apart and has its own point of view. I think if we rephrase it that it's just a fad, it's no longer popular, we could maybe rephrase that into saying like it is so popular that people are seeking novelty.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I like that reframing. And I think this is the yin to the yang of the dress watches, the shaped watches, and the small watches. I think part of the reason they command so much attention and mind share right now is because they're so different. They're quite literally, in some ways, are the antidote to that fatigue, but it doesn't mean they sell. I would guess from what I see in the industry and from the numbers, the integrated bracelet sports watches are outselling smaller watches, shaped watches, and dress watches hand over fist, both in terms of volume, but certainly in terms of total value. One thing that's interesting in that overall universe, and something recently that has gone hand in hand with the dress watch category and those shaped watches, the smaller watches, have been stone dials. Traditionally, stone dials, right, are associated with those smaller chic watches, whether it's from Piaget or others, and that is a category that is growing. And part of the reason why stone dials are performing so well and are continuing to grow and gain share is because they are now featured heavily in sport watches. So think about how many sport watches are released on a daily basis with stone dials or aventurine dials or other sort of exotic dials. Part of the reason the stone dial craze really has legs is less because of the dress watch domain where they've typically lived, but because they've been carried through to sports watches and those integrated bracelet watches. Here's another one, and I think this will be our final kind of trend in the or myth area and kind of the watch segment of things, and we'll talk about myths about the industry, is limited editions. And I think the perspective here is there are too many of them, and they're really just these sort of lazy cash grabs. And I mean, look, this one cuts. The next one really cuts and hits close to home. Of course, we got our start doing collaborative watches and limited editions. But
I'm sorry, I have to readjust myself. This pile of money I'm sitting on is so uncomfortable.
Stop. But God, not true. But there actually is an interesting anecdote from us in this as well. And the way our business has evolved, I think, is representative of what's actually going on here. But look, let's acknowledge it's not a myth. It is true that people are kind of burned out on limited edition watches, and understandably so. When I did some digging into this, however, the data really surprised me. We reached, just in terms of numbers, a number of releases, we reached actually the peak of limited edition watches in kind of the 2015 to 2020 era, which shocked me. I would have thought that we were there now. And there's a few bits of data and kind of industry scuttlebutt that explain what exactly happened. Of course, in 2020, COVID happened. And what happened there, just from an industry standpoint, was it massively gummed up the supply chain. It made getting watch parts, making watch parts, finding talent, assembling, all of that stuff really difficult. And of course, at the same time, demand also skyrocketed. So that put the industry in a position where they had to really refocus on their core. They didn't have the opportunity, or even, as they maybe had before, the necessity to try to find novelty with limited editions. They had to focus on delivering their core product lines. And it was actually around the same time as well that I think the industry became aware of the fatigue and the need to refocus. Omega's CEO famously said, and I thought this was just a few years ago. This was back in 2020, and in regard to the Speedmaster, Omega's CEO at the time said, "We're stopping limited editions." That was 5 years ago in 2020. And so the hangover from that era has been real and has been palpable, but this has really stopped a long time ago. And if you look actually at the annual reports for a number of brands, so we'll talk about Richemont here. At the end of financial year 2023, so this would have been in early 2024, they said in their earnings call, they're cutting the number of SKUs, that they were going to focus on, quote, fewer and more focused launches to reduce their product complexity. Morgan Stanley, in their 2023 Lux Consult report on the industry, they track the number of SKUs by brand. They noted declines in SKUs among Omega, interestingly, Tag Heuer, and Breitling. So those brands reduced the total number of products they're making. And limited editions count. A limited edition, usually from a large brand, gets a SKU or a product number, a reference number assigned to it. So since kind of that COVID era, the brands have really refocused on fewer SKUs and on fewer limited editions, even though it might not feel that way.
Yeah, I also think if I'm not being so glib, part of the reason that there's pushback in this regard, or people have this feeling, is that there's a difference between a limited edition that offers a unique perspective and a limited edition that feels derivative or pointless. And if you recall in our conversation with Max Booster about matte editions, one of the points we got to towards the end was that every watch that Max makes, whether it's a matte edition or an MB&F, needs to have a true reason to exist. And that reason can't just be financial. And I think back and I'm like, there are some limited editions that nobody balks at right now. So like think of Colloquium, right? I mean, how many variants of the Project One have there been? Like 6 or 7 now? But each one does have its own unique creative perspective. So nobody's complaining about that. So that's not too many limited editions. That's great. In fact, the only complaint I hear about that is I didn't get one. Versus if we go back to Omega, for example, which arguably was making a limited edition, it was like, here's the limited edition for literally Tuesday, And I think a lot of folks were burned out on that because the real question was like, what's the real reason this exists? What is it? What is the creative purpose of this? So again, I think it's important to recognize that there's like qualitative and quantitative here. And the qualitative probably speaks a little bit more to, if I'm going to invest in something, I really want to feel like it has a reason and a purpose, not just, I should buy this because it says Omega and it's got one of 250 on it or something like that. In fact, I had a client call me yesterday who was unsure if they wanted to buy a watch that's limited from us. And the main thing that was holding him back about maybe buying the watch, even though I don't think he really liked it, was, I know it's limited. And I'm like, that is not a reason to buy something. So I would say that applies just more broadly in this space in general.
Yeah. The only other note I'd have here is about that notion that part of the reason people are burned out on limited editions is because they view them cynically as sort of lazy, which you just pointed out, like they really need to have a reason for being, or cash grabs. And I think one thing to consider, and this has been our take on limited editions, like frankly, we still do them. We still do collaborative watches, but we're doing fewer of them. And the reason really is because they're not lazy. They're a lot of work. And they also, for us and for the brands, include a lot of risk. So they're not lazy from the perspective of a lot of work goes into those projects for not many watches. It's harder to amortize the costs of things like design and research and development and all the back office work that goes into a project, launching it in press and through advertising and all that stuff for a handful of watches. The cost structure doesn't really scale. Mm-hmm. It's more costly to do that. Now, of course, you'll do it if the presumption is like, well, this will be really good for the brand. It will get attention. It may receive critical praise. It will get us media and things like that, of course. But it's not the most efficient way to do that. The second thing is it requires a lot of financial risk. So for us, for instance, as a retailer, I know a lot of people think like, oh, it must be great. You have a limited edition watch that only you can sell. Well, we have to finance that project. We're wholesaling those watches from the brands, whether anyone buys them or not. And so those deals can end up being quite large, and it represents a lot of financial risk. We've been fortunate that everything we've done has sold out. Some things sell out in hours, some things sell out in weeks or months, and that's okay. But I think one of the things we've come to terms with as we've gotten a little bit more seasoned doing this work is the projects are really risky. And if a watch doesn't sell well, or if a project goes sideways, it leaves us completely financially exposed. Whereas if we're focused on a more conventional retail model, we can reasonably metabolize wholesale orders from brands. We're not buying 50 or 100 or more watches at a time. We buy a handful at a time as they sell. And that is a much more conservative and frankly sustainable business model. So I think when you had a watch industry that was growing and growing and growing and growing, limited editions were appealing. But in a watch industry, which we've talked about, which has reached more of a reasonable place once more, where it's a rational industry, the limited edition projects really are not cynical cash grabs. They're kind of the opposite. It requires us to say, do we want to go out on a financial limb to do it? And the bar of confidence we need to have is quite high. So let's talk about the industry itself. That's a good place to pivot. So we talked about these kind of myths about watches themselves and, what's popular, what's in vogue, or what's not. Let's talk about some market myths. And first I'll say the Uber market myth, which I just kind of referenced, was this myth, this notion that the sky is falling, the watch market is crashing. We're not going to talk about that here. That's not the case, but we're not going to talk about it here. Our next episode is going to be on the current state of the watch market, sort of a mid-year check-in on that. So we're not going to talk about that here now. But Asher, why don't you take the first market myth? This is another one that cuts close to home.
Sure. So there is a myth out there that the AD business model is dying. Okay. Some of this is based off of the idea that, well, let me take a step back. We have talked about in the past, and it's come up a lot, I think, that people's experiences with authorized dealers have been challenging. Certainly, we've talked about mono-brand boutiques, and I think some of the challenges that go along with that, although it's very important to recognize that often when somebody has a really bad experience, that echoes and travels a lot faster than the many, many, many multiples of those people that probably had a really great experience, just didn't talk about it. This is true of every industry and virtually every social reality.
Trust is earned in a lifetime and destroyed in a minute. That kind of thing.
There you go. But I do think it's important to note that it would be ridiculous for us to suggest that the reality of being an authorized dealer isn't changing and that the expectations haven't pivoted. And I think that, if we roll back the clock, our friend Mike Margolis used to say that like a old school jeweler used to show up and unlock his door at 9 a.m. and lock it up at 5 p.m. and people would come in and buy their watches and their jewelry and call it a day. And like, that's the business. And I think that does happen with certain brands, but for the majority of authorized dealers, especially multi-brand authorized dealers, and most assuredly our colleagues in the independent retail space, authorized dealers have really had to pivot into being what I think people want them to be, which are highly knowledgeable consultants that bring access to products that they wouldn't normally be able to get. Now, there's this other
sounds like a lot of jibber jabber.
Okay, let me make it even clearer. Ideally, what it sounds like people want from their authorized dealers, and this is what we see, by the way, from our own surveys, are somebody's going to be honest with them, somebody's going to be transparent with them, somebody's not going to play games with them and try to play a shell game or bundle them into things they don't want, and be honest about how long something's going to take, what it's going to cost, and what's involved in that, and why that watch is worthy of being purchased.
Yeah. And be as informed and passionate as they are.
Yeah. I mean, look, Gabe and I, have been collectors longer than we've been retailers. And we've all had the situation of walking into a store and having someone say, "Oh, but sir, wouldn't you love to treat yourself today?" And you feel like you've just been kissed by a dementor. Like it's just uncomfortable.
Okay. So let's be fair here then. That version, that instance of an authorized dealer, I think is dead. And
I know
dying.
It's dead because the store that did that is no longer in business.
Oh, quite literally. Yeah. Asher
literally.
did walk into a retailer once and they said, "Would sir like to treat himself
Which
today?"
is such a creepy thing to say.
Yeah. That retailer is out of business. But I think that makes the point, which is like there are fundamental challenges to the authorized dealer business.
Yeah.
And there are practices that are unsustainable, whether it's unlocking your door at 9 a.m. and hoping people will show up or treating people in that just horrible and disingenuous and haughty kind of way. But the AD business, when it's done well, is very much growing. And so let's just chat about the data for a second, because we can stop evangelizing and look at some numbers. So,
but sir, what do you mean?
Well, I'd like to treat you to some numbers. Allow me, sir. So, look, it is true that particularly around the height of the run up to and the height of the COVID market, the large holding companies were opening more and more and more company owned and operated mono-brand boutiques. Richemont was probably the poster child for that. And that is beginning not to unwind, but to plateau. So again, Morgan Stanley and their Lux Consult report back in 2023, looking at the watch industry, they noted that the growth in monobrand boutiques plateaued after 2022, and ADs still remain, by all measures, the dominant channel in markets like the United States and the Middle East and other key watch markets around the world. But the brands have told us this themselves. So in their 2023 earnings call back in 2024, Richemont said that they, quote, need to strengthen multi-brand retail partnerships after investing in owned boutiques. So this is a holding company that was really, like I said, the poster child for shifting their channel strategy to mono-brand, company-owned and operated boutiques. They said, you know what, we're taking a break from that and we're refocusing on multi-brand retailers. So the industry is telling us that this is what they're doing and they're doing things differently. However, that, of course, doesn't mean that the authorized dealers, the traditional multi-brand retailers, can get away with the things they've done for years. They, of course, need to adapt. And I think the sentiment behind the misperception here is very much valid.
Let's talk a little bit about the next misconception, which is around micro brands, that they're coming and they will destroy the Swiss watch industry. I think, with this one in particular, there's a little bit of self-awareness that I need to apply to myself, which is, if you're listening to this podcast, if you are interested in the kinds of watches that we sell, for example, you are very plugged in to the watch industry. And if you're listening to us talk about it, you're probably very plugged in.
Maybe too plugged in.
Exactly. But
seek professional help
on our next episode. But the reality is that the vast majority of people who buy watches, the millions of people who buy watches every year, don't know even that these things exist for the majority of them. And I think what we realize is that within the context of watch culture and within the context of watch community, micro brands are incredibly impactful, but they're still commercially niche. And I'll give you an example. One of our favorite founders in the industry, and certainly one of the most creative micro brands the last 5 years, Studio Underdog, Richard, the founder, and they sell just insane amounts of watches. You could say arguably the same thing about Brew. And Brew maybe is a little bit of not a good case here because they are sort of breaking a little bit more into mainstream than, say, Studio Underdog. But even if you look at the incredible volume of watches that they're selling, which are exceptional, they are proverbial drops in the bucket against the total number of watch sales in the United States, which is not a dig on either of those brands, which we love. It's in fact quite the opposite. What it's really doing is it's providing creative and commercial nudges against mainstream watches, but it's not cannibalizing anything.
No, it's raising the bar. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is these brands, they're not manufacturers.
No.
Everything they make, generally speaking, I think pretty much entirely speaking, is contract manufactured by, quote, the larger Swiss watch industry, the larger watch industry. So the factories and suppliers that they're using are not only the factories and suppliers that the mainstream brands use. In some cases, they're owned by the larger holding companies and larger, more mainstream brands. And so what these guys are doing absolutely do the micro brands push the boundaries on design and creativity? Yes. Do they push the design, the bar on innovation? Yes. We can thank the micro brand community for making things like on-the-fly micro adjustment systems and bracelets, basically an industry standard. So yes, they are pushing the bar there. And they're pushing the bar on value, what we should expect to get for our money.
Yep.
100%. But they are doing that, and they are raising the bar, therefore, for the industry overall, because the things, they're almost like this proving ground. Because you're right, the audience is generally enthusiasts, but truly they're a proving ground. And the things that they demonstrate in terms of design and creativity and innovation and value, we end up seeing adopted by the larger industry. And the larger industry does well and succeeds, not in spite of micro brands, but because of them.
Yeah.
So they perform that service as well, despite as you're pointing out here, basically being a rounding error on the industry at large
from a revenue standpoint.
When you look at sales data.
Yes,
exactly.
Agreed.
All right. Speaking of sales data, this is the final one, and it's going to sound cynical, but actually there's a ray of hope here. And I think this gets to what you were saying, which is just buy what you love. Who cares what you read on a forum or see in YouTube comments or whatever you see on TikTok or whatever? Buy what you love. There's a perception, and it's still out there. And of course, I think at a certain point in time, there was some truth to this, but there's this perception that most people, not me, but most people out there view watches as investments, and everyone is flipping. And of course, that was a mainstream meme during the height of the watch bubble and COVID watch times. But I still think there's a perception out there, and I see it all the time, that people are frustrated that they believe other collectors or other people who are in the watch market with whom they may be competing to get access to products are just flippers and people who are only, buying watches as investments or buying things that are safe. And I can say two things about that. One is we, on a daily basis, in our own interactions with clients, don't see much of that, and we see less and less and less of it. So, by way of example, it used to be that maybe once a week, a couple of years ago, we'd have a call with a client about a watch, and the question inevitably would come up, well, what's this thing going to be worth in a year? That was a common refrain or a common, objection to sale or question about sale or something people were considering, which is, if I buy this, what's it worth? And I think that was an outgrowth of the watch market of...
By the way, you're reminded, I once got asked that by a dude who was a financial advisor, which I find hilarious.
Come on, man.
Yeah, exactly. I'll tell you what, you tell me what stocks will do great next year and I'm in.
Yeah, but a stock is an investment. You're buying a
but my
company
point is,
that generates
knows
cash
what's
flow.
I get it, but nobody knows what's going to happen with anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have good stock tips though, podcast at collectiveurology.com.
There's so many problems with that comparison. But we would get this question. I think it was an outgrowth of a watch market a few years ago when, look, part of what was nice about the fact that watch values seemed to be rising and rising was it was relatively easy to move in and out of things. So if you wanted to try something, or if there was a new watch you wanted to get, the watch that you bought maybe a couple of years ago, you weren't really going to take a bath on. Maybe you'd break even or, even make some money selling. And that was a nice thing. It really helped lubricate and drive the watch market. So I think some of the questions relate to that, but I can tell you now, we do not get that question. I can't even remember the last time I spoke with a client or you or anyone on our team spoke with a client where that question came up in conversation. That has really gone away. So that's anecdotal. But I think one of the things we see in our own survey data and in other data from the industry is that price, resale value, quote, investment is not something that is top of mind or is driving watch purchases for most people. So Deloitte's watch industry study, again, from just a couple of years ago, 2023, when they surveyed luxury consumers and they asked, what are your primary motivations for buying a watch and for buying your next watch? Only 8% of buyers said that resale value was their primary motivation. Now, is it a consideration? It might not be the number one.
Yeah,
could it be the number
exactly.
2, 3, or 4?
I think that's probably a miswritten question, right?
Maybe, but I think a lot of the culture of watches, even just a couple of years ago, was like that question, that topic, that conversation point was front and center. And it really isn't front and center anymore. People genuinely are buying what they like. A lot of the actors in the market who were driving the bubble and the foment and the frenzy are out. And the people who are buying watches today, generally speaking, aren't flippers. They're not buying them for investments. They're buying what they like and what they love. And I think that's a good thing. Like we can, in other words, I think we can say we have turned a page and closed the book on that era of watch collecting. And I think that was something we were all hoping for at the height of the frenzy and of the COVID watch bubble.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's another side of it too, which is that was fun. Like it was cool when you could buy something for $15,000 and sell it for $16,000 after you'd worn it for, a year. That was fun.
But it wasn't fun when you couldn't get access to the thing that you wanted because everyone had dogpiled around the same group of brands and references, and it didn't matter what your intentions were, you weren't getting
Well, you know what else it did? It laid bare, I think, a truth about how business works that kind of, I think, stung a little bit, which is if you were a collector who was buying from an authorized dealer for 10 years prior to 2020 and you wanted something from them, you pretty much got it because you were an established client who had invested in that business over time. And if you think about whatever business you're in, that's pretty much how we treat people who invest in the businesses that we operate. But it was so frustrating for people in COVID because so many people came to the hobby with excitement and interest and felt like doors were being literally proverbially slammed in their faces.
Or even the person you're describing who had supported a brand or a dealer for a decade and bought watches.
They weren't able to get everything.
They weren't able to all of a sudden to get the stuff they want because some other big fish jumped into the pond with even more money and skipped the line.
Yeah, and I mean,
that's
look,
frustrating.
I'm painting a good faith, hypothetical here of like an honest broker as a dealer, blah blah blah. But I think like that drove this like frustration because the other thing that happened is that if you were a multi-million-dollar client and you bought something from an AD and then you decided, it's not for me, and you sold it and you made some money on it or whatever, and you bought another thing, you were okay. But if the new client came in and bought something and resold it, like, blasphemy, pull down the fire from the heavens. It's so, and I mean, look, that was also because at that period in time, the brands were riding ADs really hard about it too. So I understand it cuts both ways, and I understand the perception of like it's not fair because it wasn't. But as Gabe pointed out, we've moved past that largely, and with the exception of like a handful of references from a handful of brands, most things that you're going to buy will depreciate, some more aggressively than others. But it kind of doesn't really matter if we go back to that earlier point of the reason you're buying it is because you like it, because it's a good piece of art, because it's something that you want to support and be a patron of. And if you happen to sell it 10 years from now and you get some of your money back or most of your money back, like great. If you happen to make more off of it, like, bonanza. But that's kind of not the point. And we'll be the first to tell you that if you want an investment, go buy an index fund, not a watch.
Yeah. You made the point when we began this that... And I have to apologize. This is our second time recording this because I forgot to turn on my microphone the first time. So thank you for not passing the blame on to me. I accept full responsibility. But one of the things when we were going to re-record this, you and I talked about was like, let's make sure we're not being finger waggy or telling people why they're wrong. And if I reflect now on each one of the things that we talked about, forget whether like the meme or this sort of the truth out there in the popular imagination is true or not. Forget that for a second. The intentions behind each of these beliefs comes from a really good place. The idea that everyone else is a flipper, but me, I'm not. I buy what I like. The idea that like, oh my God, what the micro brands are doing is so compelling, they're putting the rest of the industry on blast. Or the idea that I'm really frustrated with authorized dealers who are bad actors and that business model is dying. Or I'm bored with integrated bracelet sports watches. I'm more excited by smaller cases and interesting case shapes or exotic dials or things like that. These all come from a place of good intentions, of people who want to see creativity and risk-taking, who want to deal with good actors, who want to be a good actor themselves and be a patron of something that they believe in. So forget whether any of these things are right and wrong. I think they sort of really reflect the heart or the values of an enthusiast. And I think that matters more whether or not like a particular belief that's out there is true or not true when you look at the cold, hard data. I think what's more important is that people still care about watches and they want to believe the right thing, whether the numbers sort of bear it out or not. And to me, that's a good thing.
For sure.
All right, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening. Openwork, of course, is a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And please get in touch with your questions, your feedback, your suggestions, or any other myths or misconceptions that are out there. We would love to hear them.
Stock tips. Got stock tips?
And send us your stock tips, please, and all your investment watches.
Yeah,
we need to
exactly.
know. You can do that at podcast@collectivehorology.com.